is that I have often heard Professor Weiler introducing himself as a teacher before then, and as a professor or a scholar, a brilliant scholar. I know that Professor Weiler loves teaching. He loves sharing his knowledge, his wisdom with his students. He loves to challenge him to think about the law, and how to address real and complex legal issues. So, welcome to all of you to this workshop. I'm sure we will all learn something, no matter our age, no matter our experience already as teacher. So, thank you very much, Professor Weiler. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie-José. It's been my practice in recent ICONS that I never talk about a substantive issue of public law, but about the practice of being an academic. So in Wellington, I talked about the use and abuse of artificial intelligence. In Wrocław, how to maximize your chances of getting an article published in a good journal. And today I want to talk about teaching. And this is my plan. The first part, I will really say a few words about the vocation of a teacher. And in the second and principal part, I will talk about the classroom and not teach you how to teach, but give you some ideas of what might make your classrooms more effective in teaching public law. So that's the plan. So I want to start with a little unscientific empirical study that I conducted over the last 2 years. The unscientific empirical study was to talk to, at the end it was about 70 colleagues in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia. And all of them I asked, in a very casual way, 2 questions. You're a professor. How do you define your professional identity? And 70 out of 70 said, I'm a scholar. And then I asked them, and in your professional identity, what is the most important thing you do? And 70 out of 70 said, it's my research, my writing, my books, my articles. And interestingly, not a single one defined themselves, I'm an educator, I'm a teacher. Now, this should not surprise us, because the structure of incentives that we all live now in academia leads us and leads everybody to that kind of self-understanding and self-definition. When you're in the entry level looking for a job, or even you don't have much teaching experience, so the only thing they look at your scholarship, usually in a quantitative way. You apply for a postdoc, they don't read your doctorate, but they count how many articles have you published. But it continues also later. I can't tell you how many committees for promotion, for appointment, for lateral appointments I've participated in. And the truth is that one counts the citations and one looks how many articles and where they were published, and if it's serious, are they good articles, are they excellent articles, etc. Teaching hardly figures. It's a very minimal factor in the career of an academic, a young academic and an established academic. You think you know your colleagues, and you do know your colleagues, but usually what you know, what field they're in, what they wrote. Yes, I know him, he thinks he's a genius, but in fact he's mediocre. I know her, she's really written some brilliant articles. But what do you know about your colleagues as teachers? Very, very little, very, very little. So it doesn't surprise me that in this unscientific empirical study, 70 out of 70 defined themselves as scholars and said that their scholarship is the most important thing in their professional identity. And not a single one said, I'm an educator, I'm a teacher. So now you might ask, or we might ask ourselves, so what's wrong with that? Isn't scholarship important? Don't get me wrong, make no mistake. Scholarship is important. It's very important. But we all know from our experience as students that there can be great scholars. You can't be a good teacher if you're not a decent scholar. But it's very common that we see really very, very impressive scholars who are lousy teachers. It's quite common. But I want to go beyond that. And again, I'm not trying to denigrate scholarship. Let's think from a personal point of view, from your experience of scholars, of the limitations of scholarship. So you spend 2 or 3 years writing a book. You put your soul into it. You do a lot of research. How many people are going to read your book? Think of the book presentations that we had here at ICONEST over the last 2 days. So you went to a book presentation. Let's say I went to 1 or 2 of those. There might have been 50, 60 people in the room. How many people do you think that were in the room are actually going to go and read the book? 10%? That will be optimistic. 6 or 7 years ago, I did another unscientific empirical study. We took 100 books in my field, in one of my fields, European law, published by very, very good publishers, which means that these were not shit books. They went through readers, etc. Of the 100 books, 50 did not get a single book review. It means they die. 45 got between 1 and 2 book reviews, and only 5 really emerged. And there's no relationship between this piece of data and the quality of the books. So it's just to kind of understand the limitations. So yes, I'm a scholar. The most important thing is my scholarship. Do you know how many people read an article, a law article, which is published in a law review? There are different studies about this. But usually, I'm giving you a medium, it's between 6 and 8 people on average read a law review article that is published, which must mean that about 50% of the law articles that are published, nobody reads them. And you all have had that experience. You go to one of the panels, you go because it's a subject that interests you, and you say, shit, this person never read my article. I wrote about it. It was a good article. I'm describing a demoralizing reality. Now, once again, I emphasize, it's not to denigrate the importance of scholarship, but it's to relativize it. So if you ask yourself, again, realistically, so scholarship is the most important thing I do. Can I really say, after 10 years as a scholar, after 20 years as a scholar, that my scholarship really had an important impact on the field of study? Very limited. You're lucky if you can give yourself an honest answer and say yes. It might have had some impact, some marginal impact. Can you say to yourself, my scholarship really had an impact on the law? Maybe a little bit. We're very excited when a court cites one of the articles we wrote. Usually it's some clerk who was your student who puts it in. So now, and I'm getting closer to my point, if you think the impact that you can have on your students is huge and much bigger than the impact you will have on the discipline and the impact that you will have on the law. You can really make a change as an educator, as a teacher, to the students you teach. And if you think of your life as a university teacher, most of the people here are young because the older people are thinking, what is Weiler going to teach me about teaching? I've been teaching for 25 years. He can't teach me anything. But if you project yourself forward, in 20 years, you will have taught thousands of students. And on those people, you could have an impact. So now, to conclude the first part, there's a cost by overemphasis in our self-understanding on I'm a scholar. My scholarship is the most important thing. The cost is that most of your creative energy, most of your sweat, most of your discussion with colleagues, etc., are about scholarship. And you don't invest creativity, energy to the same extent in your role as a teacher. And that's a cost. And to conclude, I think it's worth thinking about one's role as a teacher for the reasons I gave. Because as a teacher, as an educator, at the end of the day, you can probably be more impactful and have a more satisfying professional life than simply measuring everything in the optic of scholarship. So now let's get to teaching. And here's a paradox, and it's a universal paradox. Some of you have children, some of you will have children, all of you, all of us were children. You would never dream of sending your child to kindergarten if the kindergarten teacher did not get training in how to be a kindergarten teacher. You would never dream of sending your kid to primary school if the teacher who's teaching your children in primary school did not get training how to be a teacher of primary school. And even in high school, in Spain, colegio, or gymnasium, etc., somebody might have studied geography or mathematics or whatever, philosophy in university to be a high school teacher, but they would not be a high school teacher if they didn't do at least 1 year of teacher training, how to be an effective high school teacher. We would expect that. And yet, when we come to university, we don't get any training how to be a university teacher. It's a huge paradox. We are thrown into the classroom. All they want to know, are you a good scholar? Are you a mediocre scholar? Are you a promising scholar? What is your trajectory as a scholar? But in terms of teaching, we just don't give any training to university teachers how to be an effective university teacher. And that is universal. It's in every single country that I know. The result is that we have to teach ourselves how to be good teachers, because nobody else will teach us. And I want to say something about that. We don't tell our students, go and teach yourself law. We all understand that in order to learn law or any other discipline, there is an advantage that there's an experienced teacher that will teach them law. Why would it not be the same that if I said to you, go and teach yourself to be a teacher, you would say, I don't know how to teach myself to be a teacher. And two things follow from that. First of all, inertia. So usually, we end up being teachers in the model of the teachers they had when we were students. That's how they taught me, that's how I'm going to teach. Now, you might have had effective teachers, you probably also had a few lousy teachers in university, etc. But the profession of teaching, we don't think, we just follow in a sort of path-dependent way. That's how they teach in university, that's how I will teach. So here's my first piece of advice. First of all, let's be conscious, if I've persuaded you that it's worth taking teaching seriously for all the reasons I gave in the first part of my lecture, that you have to ask yourself, so how am I going to teach myself to be a more effective teacher? And the advice I give it is do it with somebody. So find a colleague. It can be a colleague in your own faculty. It can be a colleague that you were a student at university who is now teaching public law in some other university, and say, let's get together, not to talk about proportionality, not to talk about artificial intelligence and the rest of the world, which is what everybody is now interested, à titre juste, but let's get together to talk about teaching, proportionality, teaching artificial intelligence, etc. It's important to do it with somebody because the human condition is that we hide unpleasant truths from ourselves. It's difficult to live. You know, look at me, I get up in the morning, I look in the mirror and I say, what an elegant person. The power of self-delusion. We delude ourselves day after day. When you're working with somebody else, it helps because you see the weaknesses of your colleague and he or she sees your weaknesses. It's a good project to do. Take it one step further. Don't wait for the dean to do this. Just get together with a few other teachers in your faculty and organize your own workshop. And the workshop, again, it will not be on artificial intelligence or proportionality or migration or climate. It will be about teaching. 3 times a semester, have a workshop with young colleagues. Forget about the old guys. With young colleagues, let's have a workshop about teaching. Define the subject. Teaching a seminar vis-a-vis teaching a course. Teaching a large class vis-a-vis teaching a small class. Exams, whatever it is. But just make it a regular habit, and it's up to you. Don't wait for them to do it for you. I want to take teaching seriously. And the last thing I want to suggest to you that you might consider, invite a colleague, somebody you like and somebody you respect, and say, please come and sit in 3 or 4 of my classes, and I'll do the same thing for you. And then I'll give you feedback. I'll tell you where you were good as a teacher, and I'll tell you where you were not so good as a teacher. Think about that. Otherwise, it's hard for us to see our own weaknesses. And student evaluations are important, but they're limited. They usually turn to be sort of popularity test, simpatico, he's friendly, etc. But also students don't really know what effective teaching is, etc. So they are valuable, but they are limited. Now, I want to say something about to get to the classroom. Excuse me. So I'm going to give you a caricature of the classroom. And it is a caricature, but it's a caricature like good caricatures that represents a certain truth. In many, many classrooms all over the world, what you see is the teacher coming into the classroom, standing at the podium and lecturing. It can be a brilliant lecture. I'll get back to that in a minute. And maybe at the end of the class, the teacher says, any questions? And some students will raise their hand and ask questions. The teacher will answer them. That's also how many people, when they start teaching, they prepare their courses. So they say, I'm going to teach, let's say I teach international law. So I need to give a class about sources, and then I need to give a class about subjects, and then I need to give a class about state responsibility, and then I need to give a class about remedies, and then I need to do some substantive international laws, so there will be use of force and environment and climate, etc. And we prepare a list of lectures on every aspect of the topic that we are meant to teach. And the first year, it's hard work to prepare the lectures. Sometimes we cheat. We just take our notes from when we were students and just turn them into lectures. Not a bad idea, actually, if they're good notes. And then in the second year, it's a little bit easier. And in the third year, it's much easier. You adapt your lectures a little bit. There's some new cases, there's some new legislation. But basically then, teaching becomes less challenging. I've got my series of lectures. It worked well. Now I can put all my energy back into scholarship. I said it's a caricature, but it's a caricature that represents, I think, reality. So I want to explain to you the limitations of this form of teaching. Now, again, make no mistake. there is a role for brilliant lecturing in the classroom. There are certain subjects that the most effective way to teach them is by giving a brilliant lecture. One has to think carefully, what is the subject that a good lecture would be the most effective way to teach? But there certainly is a role for lecturing. But now I'm giving you what I consider one of my, quote, golden rules, unquote. If you think of the way you teach, and all your classes take the same form, 27 brilliant lectures, you're doing something wrong. And now I'm going to explain why you're doing something wrong. So let's think, instead of studying law, or instead of teaching law, you're teaching cooking, cordon bleu. So the teacher goes and he says to you, the first thing I want you to see what a good chicken Kiev is like, or ventresca di atún. And you eat it and you say, this is fantastic. I never had such a ventresca di atún. This is the model. You've learned something. You've learned what it means to cook a good ventresca di atún. But imagine that the cooking class ends there. It's laughable, right? Because now you say to him, teach me how to cook a ventresca di atún. Don't let me see just what a good ventresca di atún. That's the problem with the brilliant lecture. So you gave them a brilliant lecture. They know now something very profound, very good about the law. But you haven't taught them how they can teach themselves. The law is going to change. You won't be there to teach them when they're practicing law, etc. So simply to give a brilliant lecture is like giving them the chicken Kiev. This is what you need to know. This is what a chicken Kiev has to be like. But you haven't taught them how to cook it. And that's the limitation of a lecture course, of a course which consists of 27 brilliant lectures. I hope I've convinced you. In other words, it's not enough to give them fish, you have to teach them how to fish. And the lecture is a very limited way of teaching them how to fish. So how do we do that? So the first thing, you have to define for yourself. I have my list, you will have your list. What are my objectives of teaching? In this course, as a teacher, what do I want to accomplish? And of course, number one, and this reflects the caricature I gave them, they have to know constitutional law of the jurisdiction. They have to know administrative law of the jurisdiction. They have to know what are the sources of international law. They have to know what is the content of the Bill of Rights, etc. So knowledge is an important part. But we all know the reality. Whatever subject you teach them, you cannot teach them the whole subject. You cannot. So already there you're making a choice. And the choice expresses itself as following. What is the right balance between broad and superficial, or very deep but too narrow? We all have to make that choice, but we have to make the choice because we're not going to cover everything. And that, when you get together, if you follow my advice, you get together with colleagues and say, let's talk about, we both teach constitutional law, we don't both teach administrative law. Let's talk about the design of the course. Let's make ourselves better teachers. That will be a first subject of discussion. What topics will we teach? What topics will we not teach? How do we balance between broad and superficial, profound but too narrow? Now, I'll tell you something else. In every class that I teach, I don't start the class, whether it's international trade, international law, etc., with here is an overview of the Constitution, here is the syntax and grammar of international trade law, etc. I always start my class in saying, I want to tell you what are my teaching objectives. This is what I want to teach you in this class. I'm going to teach you law, I'm going to teach you, I'll get to that in a minute, how to analyze cases, I'll teach you hermeneutic choice, I'll teach you hermeneutic sensibility. I give them the list of objectives. This is what I'm going to try and teach you in the course. And then I say to them, the most important thing I'm going to try and teach you is I'm going to try and teach you how to teach yourself law, because that's what you'll have to do in your professional life. And then I say to them, fasten your seatbelts. There will be one subject that we will not cover in class, but will be a big question in the exam. So if I teach you international economic law, fine. I will not teach you the use of force, but there will be a question on the use of force. And why will this be so? Because that question, I will be testing your ability to teach yourself. So pay attention also to the didactic dimension of our class, because you have to learn how to teach yourself, and you will be examined on that. It's scary, but at the end of the class and after the exam, they're pretty satisfied, because they suddenly see, look, I taught myself the use of force, so I taught myself international environmental law, and I wrote a good answer. I didn't only learn what he taught me, I learned how to teach myself what he didn't teach me. So one objective, I said, is to teach the law, but also to teach how to teach the law. Then, number 2, how to read legislation, how to read the Constitution, how to read a case. I want to teach you how to read critically a case. I want to teach you how to read critically the Constitution. I want to teach you how to read critically legislation. Now comes my second golden rule. Even if it's not the custom in your jurisdiction, in your university, that you require students to read material before the class, at least in some of your classes, you have to require the students to do reading before the class. So you don't have to be American, you know, for every class you have to read, etc. But you cannot teach a whole course where you're not assigning some readings to the student. And another golden rule, you never just say, read this case, read this article, read the Bill of Rights, etc. You always give them a guidance. When you read it, this is what I want you to pay attention to. This is what we're going to do in class on the basis of the reading. If you don't read it, the class will be meaningless to you. Don't give too much reading. I never assign more than 30 pages for a class, because I'd rather they read it carefully than assign 120 pages that they will. Now, why is this so important? Because when you assign different readings, and I will talk about that also in a minute. You see, I'm not a good teacher. I have 45 minutes, and I already realize that we're running out of time. So I'm going to rush just a little bit. A classroom is not a seminar. So when you have an interactive classroom, it's not like a seminar where you're really discussing with students, open questions, etc. An interactive classroom is lecturing. You have your lecture. The only difference is you lecture through the mouths of the student. And it's a much more effective way. It's a much more effective way to give the lecture. First of all, the internalization is much deeper. It's been studied. You give a lecture, a brilliant lecture, the retention rate is between 30 and 40%. You lecture through the mouths of the students, the retention rate is between 60 and 70%. So it's more effective. But you're doing something differently. So if you take them, if you read with them, let's say, a provision of the Constitution, of a piece of legislation, you ask them, we've read Article 7. Let's talk about different ways of interpreting Article 7. And you speak to the students. What do you think? Let's just discuss, not me telling you the different ways. You come up with different ways. How can this be interpreted differently? Now, here's a little trick. This is not a golden rule, but it's a little trick. in some jurisdictions, etc., students are not used to the teacher asking them a question and speaking up in class. They get used to it very quickly. And the little trick I want to teach you, you ask them a question, okay, give me 2 or 3 different ways we can interpret this provision. And then you say to them, for the next 3 or 4 minutes, speak to your neighbors. So they speak to other students next to them. They talk about it. It has an advantage that then they feel more confident to answer the question, because they will always say, okay, I say now, time to talk. We discussed. They're spreading the responsibility. We discussed. And you get better answers because they talked about it, they thought about it, etc. But you can see the advantage. Instead of just telling them, this is Article 7 of the Constitution, here are 2 alternative ways of interpreting it, this is the correct way to interpret it, this is how the court interpreted it, it's much more effective if you do them the work. You can't teach somebody to be a brain surgeon by simply looking at you doing brain surgery. At some point, they have to take the scalpel in their hand and cut into the flesh. And this is why I insist that you can only achieve this result by assigning a reading and then walking the students with the lessons you want to teach them through that reading. Now, remember that law is a communicative discipline. Law is a communicative discipline. Much more communicative discipline than, say, mathematics. We negotiate, we litigate, etc. So I tell my students, law is a communicative discipline. What we will have to teach and what we will have to learn is not just what to think about the law, what is the correct interpretation, but how to communicate it most effectively, both in writing and orally. Now, if you accept that law is a communicative discipline, that the how is as important as the what, you have to start thinking, how am I going to sharpen their communicative skills, both orally and in writing? If I didn't have to finish in 7 minutes, I would give you some, quote, tricks, unquote, to do that. But I don't have to. The minute you define to yourself, it's a communicative discipline, and this is some of the things I have to do, you will work out the best ways to achieve that result. Now, I want to tell you something about observational standpoints. So, you're having an interactive class. This is one of the classes where you're not lecturing, but you're lecturing through the mouths of the students. It's very, very effective to change the observational standpoint. You say to the students, today our observational standpoint will be litigators. So this is the case, and now we're going to simulate a strategy of the law firm. They get the case, and they'd have to decide, how are we going to approach this case? What is going to be our main argument? What is going to be the most important argument? What will be the most effective way to do it? What will be the difficulties in making this argument? What is the other side going to say? It's the observational standpoint which makes them see the law through a different lens. The next class, you say, today we will have the observational standpoint of a legislature. So here is the dilemma. The legislator has to decide about artificial intelligence, content control on the internet. Let's do a simulation of the legislator. You're going to be the industry, you're going to be civil society, just divide it. You're going to be a party on the left, you're going to be a party of the right. What is going to be your input to the legislative procedure? Or another example of observational standpoint legislature, you read a piece of legislation or the Constitution, and you see that the cases are all over the place, real crap. And together with your students, you realize the problem is that the legislation is badly drafted. that the Constitution doesn't really do what it's meant to do here. So in the classroom, you say, let's imagine that we are the legislator. How are we going to redraft this article to make it more effective in the light of what we've read? I'm just giving you examples of the utility of changing the observational standpoint. Now, what to read? So the obvious thing is we'll read the constitutional, we'll read the legislation, we will read court cases. But here are a few other ideas of what you might assign to your students to read. You can read briefs. I used to teach a course at the College of Europe, how to win cases before the European Court of Justice. I always took cases that all the students knew. But what we read in class were the briefs of the lawyers. And then we analyzed, why was this brief more persuasive to the court than that brief? We looked at the Commission of the European Union, the most experienced litigator, because they appear in every single case. So I said, they are the most experienced litigator. Let's see how they build their briefs. I'm just giving you an example of unconventional. It's not just the legislation, the court case, etc., but alternative readings. Have them read legislative history, have them read or even watch on a video a debate in the legislature, a debate in the Security Council of a provision of the United Nations Charter, etc. It doesn't only make for an exciting class, you're learning something different by giving those different types of reading. I want to say something about comparative. So you're teaching a case, an important case. Don't turn your class into comparative law. But let's say the American court does it. I'm going to ask you to read a court of the German Constitutional Court. It's not because I want you to teach you German constitutional law. You will understand better American constitutional law or Italian or Spanish constitutional law if you see how another court with a similar provision, we respect freedom of expression, etc., reaches a different result. And then it gives you the possibility to do two things, both analysis and normative. Why do you think our court did it this way and their court did it that way? And then you can ask them, and who do you think did a better job in reaching a better solution for the kind of society that you or I or somebody else might want to live in? It's not systematic comparative law, but showing them how another court does the same thing and does it differently enables you to understand your own system better. Now and again, teach a lousy case, a really wrong decision. Because what you will teach them is how to see a wrong decision, how to critique a wrong decision. What does it mean to have a wrong decision? We usually take the cases that decided the law, but there's value in just, in order to teach them critical thinking, to take bad decisions, to take wrong decisions, to talk about what does it mean to be a wrong decision, etc. A few last comments. Note-taking in class. So you can see I'm pretty extreme in some things. So in my class, the students are not allowed to take notes because I tell them it's not a class in stenography. It's a law class. But I have designated note takers. So for every class, it rotates among the class. There are 3 or 4 students who take notes. And then I review the notes. I'm cheating. My TAs review the notes. And then everybody in the class has it. At first, they complain. They say, I need to take the notes. After 2 weeks, 90% of the class say, that's fantastic. I can really focus on the class because there will be notes for the class. And once or twice during the semester, I will have to be the note taker. Think about it. You get a more engaged class if they're not busy writing down every word you say, but they're actually listening and thinking of what you're saying to them. Appeal. Tell your students, I'm wanting you to read this case, but what I want you to think about, if you had to write an appeal about the case, write on one page, 7 points, what will be the content of your appeal, and that's what we will discuss in our next class. Same thing I said about redrafting the law. You get the idea. I come back to the basic golden rule, or two. You have to define what are my objectives in teaching, and it can't just be they have to know the positive law. And once you've defined the objectives of the teaching, what is the most effective way to teach each one of these objectives? And your little self-test, your little reality check, if all my classes follow the same format, it means I'm doing something wrong. Thank you. Do I want to take some questions? No, but I will. And also, you know, the next panel starts at 10 o'clock, so we should allow people to get in time, and there's a constitutional, fundamental right, the right to pee. So maybe 1 or 2 questions. Yes, ma'am. But I can't hear, so there should be a microphone somewhere.
Hello, good morning.
I think I know you.
Hello, my name is Mihaela Tofan. I am a Jean Monnet professor and chair from Romania and a former NYU fellow. I can confess that the courses I have attended were the privilege of teaching, and all the tips that Professor presented to us this morning were actually used in his lectures. So thank you for that. My question is, don't you think that in most of the cases, the teaching is actually a vocational profession?
Is what?
A vocational profession, something that is in connection with your vocation. Because, of course, you can teach somebody how to teach, but in order to make them brilliant is something in connection to your talent and to your vocation as a human being on this earth. Thank you.
That's what I was trying to say. You just said it better. Okay, guys, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.